Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven, a show about writing and publishing with your host, J.F. Garrard.
Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven. Today our special guest is Kim Fahner. And Kim lives and writes in Sudbury. Her debut novel, The Donoghue Girls, is a piece of historic fiction, and it's being published by Latitude 46 in September 2024. Kim's most recent book of poems is Emptying the Ocean, and she was a Poet Laureate for the City of the Greater Sudbury from 2016 to 18. Kim's next book of poems, her sixth, The Pollinator Field, will be published in spring 2025. Kim is currently the first vice chair of the Writers' Union of Canada, and she was recently a finalist for the 2023 Ralph Gustafson Poetry Contest and may be reached via her author website, and the links are all in our podcast notes below. So thank you very much, Kim. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about how you started writing poetry and how you achieved this Poet Laureate status?
I've been writing poems since I was little, but I was lucky to have a really great elementary school librarian named Rose Belland, who used to save certain books for me. I had great English teachers all the way through, including one grade 8 teacher who encouraged me to write creatively. And I worked with many great writing mentors over the years. So the laureateship came up a number of times here in town. And finally, at the time it first came up, I was caring for an elderly parent. So it was the wrong time for me. And then when it came up again for the 2016-18 term, I thought, well, this is about time. And I had a vision for using it to bring poetry out of the elitist tower it usually holds, out into the streets of the town. So my goal was to bring poetic graffiti everywhere around Sudbury.
So I was reading about that. So tell me a little bit more about the poetic graffiti and where did you get this idea from?
I just started to think about how people often, when you ask them what they think of poetry, say, I hate it. And I teach high school, and so many students say, I don't want to do poetry, often because their teachers have avoided it. So it's interesting to see if someone has never sort of come to it in an open, accessible way, how they automatically close their doors to it. So I wanted to make it's a mining town. It's bigger than a mining town now. It's diversified, but I wanted to sort of see if there were citizen poets, and a number came forward for the contest. So I did street poetry, rain poetry here based on something I had read online that happened in Boston, where they, had small stanzas and you would paint them onto the sidewalks, and they only appear when it rains. So it's a special environmentally careful paint, and it only lasts a few months depending on the weather. So we did that, and then I did a thing called Poetry on the Streets, and it was downtown and around the city again with vinyl posters that were posted in businesses that were open to having those in their windows. And then I worked on putting poems up at our airport. So the laureates, every laureate has a stanza in the window of the security area, just because, you think of waiting, I would like to see art and poetry's art. And then I guess the other thing that I'm really proud of is putting poetry at the hospital in palliative care, and that was important to me. So the laureates up to me, there were 4 of us. There are 4 stanzas at the hospital in windows. So when people are waiting while people are ill or dying, because that was happening with my dad at the time, I kept thinking, oh, we could easily put poetry here. And so when I became laureate, I thought, I'm going to see if that's possible. And it was. They were very much open to it. So a number of places, the airport and also the Health Sciences North was fantastic about working with me for that.
But you're right. I don't think any of the teachers I've had in the past were really into poetry. So it's something, it is kind of sad. Now, what do people do as a poet laureate?
You act as an ambassador for your city, so you have to have a legacy project. Those were parts of my legacy project. I also brought Project Bookmark Canada town, so that highlights a local author with an actual bookmark. But for me, it was to engage your community and be an ambassador culturally for poetry and the literary arts here, but also beyond, So I met some really amazing poets laureate while I was laureate, that I'm still friends with now. Now, that's not everybody's choice to do that sort of community work, but for me, I've always done volunteering in my town, and I wanted to make it interactive and sort of really holistic and artistic.
You also do a lot of volunteer work. I mean, the writers union, is that a volunteer work? Is that another job?
No, it's volunteer work. My parents both were really community minded. My father was involved with a number of organizations while he was, here. And I grew up being aware of that. So I got involved with the Writers Union of Canada way back in 2018, and I was on a committee. And then I kept saying, oh, I really like this. And I felt more included. Being in Sudbury, there's a writing community for sure. But I wanted to sort of reach out towards other communities where I knew there were stronger literary groupings. Um, so I found that in TWUC. I found great companionship, and I really believe in what it does as an organization. There was an opening for Ontario representative in 2019 for the 2020 term. And I took it and I loved it and that was during the pandemic. So we did a lot of virtual open mics. That's what I did as part of my work as representative for Ontario. I started a newsletter. And then the option for becoming first vice came up. So I ran for the position, and it leads to chair. So I knew it was going to be a 4-year commitment. And I'm in my second year as vice. So next spring, I'll become chair.
Well, I volunteer for another organization, the Canadian Authors Association, but
Oh, right.
as the president of the Toronto branch, so we're a bit smaller.
But that's great, right? Because you get to take part and meet new people and really make a difference for especially emerging writers. I didn't have that networking support community really beyond the north because we're a different region here, really.
Yeah, we've been trying to host in-person events, but I have to admit it's like pulling teeth, I think, in the beginning. Like after COVID, it seems like everyone's hiding. So
It
it's
is.
hard.
I know. It's still difficult, and it's still mostly virtual, I think, from what I see with TWUC and some hybrid events, but people are still nervous, and rightfully so, you
Hmm.
know. Yeah.
Okay, now let's talk a little bit about your book that's come out. Well, it's coming out in September. So tell me a little bit about what inspired the Donoghue Girl. And is any of it based on your family at all? Or?
It is.
Oh,
It's based on a family rumor that my great grandfather had 10 children. And so a couple of great aunts mentioned that my maternal grandfather had dated my great aunt, Nora, and then moved on to my grandmother, Alice. So I started thinking, I had never heard this while my grandmother was alive, as happens. And I was thinking about secrecy and all of that, privacy, but also transparency. But then I thought, okay, it's secret. It seems like a secret to me, but while they were living it, people were
they
present
do.
for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I didn't know it. And I wondered why she hadn't mentioned it. And it explained a lot about her relationship with her family. And I just started thinking about this weird triangle because they would have been in this strange situation as two women and a man, and dynamics and feminism at the time of World War II and the Winter War in Finland. And my head started turning. So I wasn't sure though. I was a poet mostly. And I really have to credit Lawrence Hill, who's a mentor and friend, because I went out to Sage Hill for a poetry retreat with Ken Babstock back in 2014. And I met Lawrence Hill there, and he said, well, why are you afraid of writing this story? We were talking one time, and I said, I'm just a poet. And he said, no, you're a writer, and you should totally mine this story, which I thought was funny because I live in a mining town. So then I started thinking about how it could work itself into a novel.
Oh, very cool. Has anyone in your family read it?
No, I'm, you're laughing because I'm very nervous.
No, no one in my family reads my stuff anyways, but
Oh,
it's okay.
I think that's true, actually. They're lovely. They buy books, my
Yes,
extended
they buy it.
family. But my parents aren't alive, and my sister hasn't read it, but is supportive. I've had to tell them it's not autobiographical to the family
Yeah.
history. I've completely changed a lot of things. And the triangle, whether or not that's even a true rumor, I believe it is because two great aunts said it. It's not a horrible, it's an imagination of what those relationships would have been. So
Oh,
I have to always sort of just bolster that before they read it this fall. I'm a little bit nervous. I'm not going to lie to you.
now, did you find it very different to write a novel compared to poetry?
Yes.
Okay.
Um, it's funny. I way back in my 20s, because I'm 53 now, so I applied to the Humber School and I worked with Timothy Finley way back then as a mentor. And I worked with short stories with him. So I was writing short fiction in my 20s. Nothing of that ever was really published. I won a couple of local writing contests back then, but I had never really thought of a novel. So what freaked me out at the beginning was the scope of it compared to a poem or a short story. Um, just to think of the arc of the plot and the character interactions and subplots and how do you manage timelines, it seemed very overwhelming to me. So when I came to write this, I worked with Marnie Woodrow, who's a great book coach. She was really helpful in sort of guiding me through some of the process of working towards a long piece. And a local author named Matthew Haiti, who's a playwright. I was taking a playwrights course with him and I told him I was starting a novel and I was terrified. And he said, why don't you just write it like you would a play, a scene by scene by scene? So I feel like I started, I'm working on a second one now and I'm writing it differently because I've written that first one. So I've, worked out some kinks in terms of how I approach writing the novels now.
Now, if someone is starting to write a novel, like what would your best advice be?
Um, my goodness, well, I would hope they would be readers. I always think when I speak to emerging poets, especially, that if you can read novels, if you're writing novels, read plays if you're writing plays. So don't just, start writing a novel if you've never been a novel reader. And then to have an idea of where you think it's going to go, because it can be any length. There's a certain length, obviously, you want to sort of think of because you don't want to bore people or not get them interested enough to go for the length. But you have to think about characters and developing those characters fully and plot lines and all of the things that you have to think about when it's structure, right? There has to be the architecture there for you to have characters that will actually be vibrant enough to work their way through the piece narratively.
Cool, cool. Now, how did you go about to get it published?
Well, at first I started sending to agents, which is really depressing. And I'm sure so many writers across Canada will, relate to this. So sending out to agents and then having some write back and say, please send more, and then being excited and waiting months and then saying no. And that was really frustrating. I always think that's the part that's hard because you start to doubt yourself as a writer and you start to doubt your work. And that just did not work. So I think I did that for about 5 years. And then I thought, this is ridiculous. So I started querying some presses whose books I loved, I had read, and I thought, these are really great novels. Mine might fit in there. And then it just didn't work. So I finally thought, I don't know why I didn't think of this before. Latitude's a Northern press, and Heather Campbell's brilliant and publishes Northern authors. But at that point, I thought, well, if agents don't want it, maybe no one wants to read it. I was really down on my own work. So I sent it to her and she read it and said, it's lovely. We'd love to publish it. And I said, oh, that's for real? Are you sure? Because it's not, you really at that point, all that rejection from agents, it brutally kind of sent me back. And she did accept it. And so that's how it came to get a house and a home in Latitude. And I'm really pleased to be working with her. She's great.
Yeah, I went through a similar process with my mother. Oh gosh, I remember I was entering this manuscript for a contest and there was a week left to the
Yeah.
deadline. Thinking, oh, should I send it in early? Should I pick at it? And I was like, you know what? Something always happens. And then that week my mom died, like suddenly, like it was just out of the blue. So I still remember that. And
Yeah.
then didn't win the contest. They didn't have anything bad to say, the judges. It was just it didn't
Wow.
win, right? Like you never know what it is. And then yeah, looking for an agent and getting rejected.
That's
And then
part of the,
yeah, so
yeah.
finally, yeah, small press, right? But that's okay. That's fine. I was
Well, small
putting
presses
it
are
everywhere.
great. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think small presses are great. So I'm always amazed when emerging writers, some of them very young, will think they'll jump right into Simon and Schuster or
Oh
something.
yeah,
Like
they're like, we want Penguin. We don't want small press.
I I always think, oh my goodness, maybe not. If it's taking those of us who have, tried, it does take a long time to work through the process of, submitting and then waiting for rejection or acceptance. But that process can really make you get in your head and start to doubt you. And then life, as you're saying, you think of caring for elderly parents and how life happens. That's in the middle of waiting. And you think, oh, maybe this time, and then no. So
Yeah, well, I mean, even J.K. Rowling, when she was writing Harry Potter, she was like laid off at the time, right?
I
So
know,
you
yeah,
just don't know.
you
But
don't.
yeah, I mean, and then there are people that win the lottery, but I mean, there's only so many people that win the lottery. So,
You have to
but
be persistent, I think, when you talk about writing a novel. And not when you start writing a novel, you maybe just focus on the novel. Don't worry about where you're going to send it after. I know a lot of people worry about where it's going to be published. I'm always worried about, oh my goodness, does this actually make sense? I have to fix this whole section.
yeah, true enough, true enough. So, Kim, you're going to do a reading for us. Can you explain a little bit about what you're going to read? Give us a bit of context before you start.
I thought I would read you a part that's it's from early on in the novel, in the first third of the novel, which kind of shows how the three characters are Anne, who's the sister who was dumped, and Lizzie, who becomes Michael's wife, interact, just given the tension. So I'll start with, and it's set in the church. So the church plays a role indirectly in the novel just because Irish Catholics and the church and how oppressive it would be for people who didn't really follow it completely. It was brisk that morning, but the sky was a clear robin's egg blue with wisps of white cloud draped across it. St. Michael's nearly glowed halo holy in the bright morning light. God lived above the surface here in Creighton, but minded those men who toiled underground. You never could tell when things might go wrong. At least, God was up there while the men were all down below, somewhere underground, aware of everything and blessing them silently. Anne imagined maybe she was turning towards the church, as Nellie had already done by joining the sisters. Anne couldn't imagine why Nellie wanted to be a nun. Anne thought most days that Nellie was honestly the prettiest of them all, even if Lizzie and Maisie thought it was Anne. She cringed inwardly at the thought, knowing that they were far off from the truth. After all, Michael had left her, so how could she be that appealing after everything was said and done? She couldn't figure men out. She was the eldest in the family and far too single for her father's liking. Anne was sure he had imagined that she and Michael would have kept courting for a few more months and then likely would have gotten engaged. She hated going to Mass. Well, that wasn't true. She loved the ritual of it all, but she dreaded catching sight of Michael Power, all dressed up and handsome. He had been hers for a short time, so it was painful to now see him, searching the family pew for Lizzie's silhouette. His eyes always skimmed over Anne, lingering a second or two, but then the glances became fewer and fewer as he moved on towards courting Lizzie in his head. Not that Lizzie had an inkling. She was the fireball she always had been, The last thing she would do was hurt Anne, at least not on purpose. As she trudged up the steps of the church, smiling at Father Regan on the way inside, she dropped her eyes downwards, focusing on the solid wood footings of the pews. If she didn't look up, if she didn't see Michael, maybe things would go smoothly. It was hard to focus on praying when your heart was broken and you felt discarded. No one else seemed to even notice her sadness, which sat squarely inside her rib cage like a deep ache. Anne was hopeful that the ache and embarrassment at the thought of their encounter in the grove would lessen in time, but she couldn't think it was even possible. Having been erased from Michael's heart and mind hurt her more than it would ever wound him. That was the luck that men had. Their hearts seemed to mend more quickly than those of the women they had once loved and then wounded. Each one was a notch on a bedpost, it seemed, and then they were left behind. It was historical and legendary how men behaved before they took a wife, and maybe even afterwards, for all she knew. Lizzie was aware, as they walked toward St. Michael's from home, that they looked like a small flock of ducklings following their parents, the three girls and Jack huddled close to one another. 6 of them trundled down the street together. Lizzie had worn her church dress, which was a white eyelet frock trimmed with yellow ribbon. She loved yellow. Even on the grayest of days, when it snowed or rained throughout the year, if she had a bit of yellow ribbon nearby, she could look at it and forget about anything that seemed to drag her spirit down. She fingered a bit of loose ribbon now as she trailed behind Maisie, Jack, and Anne. Once inside the church, Lizzie slipped into her daydreaming. It happened every time. There was simply no stopping it. Mrs. Taylor's hat was slate gray, the color of the wet rock at the mine. It was a depressing color, Lizzie thought to herself as she listened to Father Regan drone on and on about salvation and helping one's neighbors. It was the same damn thing every Sunday. She resented having to be here, being forced to listen to him, and she was too easily distracted by the feathered quill that sprouted rebelliously from Mrs. Taylor's pillbox hat. She sighed too loudly, and she immediately felt her mother's eyes on her, disdainful and disparaging. Lizzie rolled her eyes heavenward, looking up at the rafters of the ceiling, wishing she could just hop up there and bounce away somewhere. In her head, in her imagination, she drifted from rafter to rafter like a blown-up balloon, and then out the door that must have somehow been left ajar. Then, from there, well, she might have gone anywhere. She thought of Europe mostly, and found herself wondering how she could ever manage to visit there. How would the daughter of a merchant in a simple mining town ever make it south to Toronto, east to Montreal, and then down the St. Lawrence in some sort of ship? Lizzie shut her eyes, squeezing the lids tightly together so that there was a zigzaggy line across what had been her field of vision. She imagined someone opening the church's main door, and then she could see herself bouncing down the front wooden steps, vaulting over the various heaps of rock and gravel, a barren landscape to be sure, and then right on down the road, out past Lively and Coppercliff, and beyond it to Sudbury, and maybe even on towards North Bay, Pembroke, and finally Ottawa. Phew, that would be a trip of some dimension. Where would she go from there? Perhaps in a more ladylike fashion, she would deflate and squish herself back into the form of a respectable young woman. She would have to wear that boring navy draped dress with the pearls so that she would be in complete disguise as she moved on to Montreal and boarded a ship bound for England. She imagined, stop off in Ireland just to see if any of the relatives were still living. Most had come here, so she doubted there would be many people left to visit all those years later. Lizzie had heard her father speak of Limerick and of Bunratty Castle, where some governess of an ancestor had run off with the gardener, not letting the grass grow under their feet. No point in thinking about it, though. It was also done and gone. You may as well just fall down a mine shaft like Alice in Wonderland or something just as fanciful. Lizzie was interrupted by a fierce elbow to her ribs. Her eyes flew open, and she knew without even looking that her mother would be glaring at her from down the long space of the pew. And she was. Jack jabbed her and tried to warn her to pull her up out of her daydream so she could avoid her mother's wrath. Lizzie sighed. She knows, Jack, she knows. I'm a lost cause. Nothing to worry about. Her eyes fell to the pair of hands that rested in her lap. She knew they belonged to her, but it didn't feel like it. She felt outside her own body somehow. Jack shushed her now. Hush, she's only just caught sight of you not paying attention. You didn't look like you were sleeping, so that's a good thing. He straightened his jacket, tugging at the hem so that he looked more ironed out somehow. Lizzie cast a glance down the pew, only to encounter her mother's fierce ice blue gaze. A sharp nod of the head, maternal eyes darting towards the pulpit and altar, and then back to Lizzie, a pointed and gloved finger jetting out towards the front of the church. Lizzie nodded almost imperceptibly. Yes, 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 I will pay attention. The words were implied in the way in which Lizzie raised her eyes up from the folded hands in her lap, and in the way in which she now tilted her head slightly to one side, as if trying to catch a phrase or notion that had somehow passed her by unaware. Lizzie thanked her lucky stars for Jack. He was closest in age and likeness and even in spirit. The hour of Mass went on for what seemed to be an eternity, even though she knew it wasn't so. Lizzie was good with God, so why did she even need to prove it every week anyway? It was a ridiculous assumption that God was so far above humans that he wouldn't know they had flaws, or that they loved him regardless of whether they darkened the church stoop. At the end of it all, the final hymn droning in her ears, she trudged up the long pew and down the aisle of St. Michael's.
Well, thank you very much for your reading. Well, thank you very much for coming on the Artsy Raven, and good luck with all your other projects.
Okay, thanks so much.
For more upcoming episodes of the Artsy Raven about writing and publishing, visit us at jfgarrard.com/arpodcast. A reminder to Patreon subscribers that there's bonus content available for every episode on the Patreon website. If you enjoyed the show, you can show your appreciation by buying us some digital coffee. The Artsy Raven is produced by J.F. Garrard. The voice in the show's introduction is Chris Gorman, and music is by Tim Moore. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe.